And good evening, everyone. It is Tuesday, May 19th, 2020. We are back here this week for our weekly COVID-19 live town hall update with Dr. Sanjay Udoshi. My name is John Daw, and I want to welcome you all here joining us this evening. For those of you who have joined us the past few weeks, you'll notice a people are sort of missing. We had a wonderful newspaper article in our local newspaper here in northeastern Pennsylvania, and had a spike in interest in this tonight. And so we didn't want to clutter like 20, 30 people on one screen. So if you have a question, please do use the chat room feature or on the participants page, or I guess the reactions button on your Zoom. You can raise your hand and we will unmute you and ask you to start your video if you like, and you can ask your question at that point. We will have specific breaks throughout the evening for questions. And just to let you all know, tonight's show is being recorded and live streamed to our Facebook page. If you are watching from the Facebook page, feel free to leave a comment there. Please note that we don't always get them right when you leave them. There is about a 30 to 40-second delay. So have some patience with us there. Now I'm happy to turn it over to my good friend, Dr. Sanjay Udoshi, who is like 3 miles that way in Shavertown, Pennsylvania. Good evening, Sanjay.
Good evening, John. Thank you so much for joining again. This is the 9th week of holding these town halls and the 7th week of John producing them. So John asked me to introduce myself or reintroduce myself to those who are joining us for the first time. My name is Sanjay. I'm a physician by training, internal medicine. I did my undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania in cell and molecular biology, during which time I was involved in undergraduate biomedical research and worked at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania as a research assistant during my undergraduate days, studying HIV. Thereafter, I went to medical school, British medical system at Jawaharlal Nehru Medical College, which is now ranked the third ranked university in India. After that, I came back to the United States, having started a company in India, having developed a research-based electronic medical record system. After involvement in the IT side of healthcare, I got involved in health policy consulting, and then obviously thereafter joined the Geisinger Health System and did my fellowship in clinical decision support. After working at Geisinger for a number of years, I was recruited to work at Oracle. Oracle is a large technology company. I worked in the Health Sciences Global Business Unit in the division focused on healthcare informatics, and was responsible for architecture and development of applications that were useful in population health strategies. Most recently, I've been involved in clinical genomics and working on cancer genomics, as well as the entire genomics field as it's applying to healthcare right now. And as you can tell, genomics is becoming extremely important in fighting new diseases like COVID. So that's my background: population health, cell and molecular biology, clinical genomics, and IT. So Today, we're going to try to freeform the approach to the town hall. Last week, I tried to do a kind of Andrew Cuomo style PowerPoint presentation, but it seems that having a conversation and then just following a basic outline is more constructive and useful. I have all of the recent information collected over the last 2 weeks on various topics at my fingertips here. And so I look forward to proceeding and getting your questions. John, do you want to help me start off with directions on what we'll be addressing first?
Sure. I think that what we want to do, as Sanjay said, is some of this will be review for you, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, it won't be. So what we wanted to start off with is looking at the dashboard that Johns Hopkins University puts out, and I will throw that up on the screen here. Go.
Okay, so every week we've been reviewing the numbers to begin with. And as you can see, we're now approaching 5 million confirmed cases across the globe. And this is clearly a pandemic. This is not an epidemic. This is...
Sanjay, I think we lost your sound here for a second.
Okay. Are we better on the sound?
There we go.
Okay. So, I mean, this emerged from Wuhan probably in November, December, and started to spread in Europe, and then obviously came to us by late January and February. And this is just an unbelievable once-in-a-lifetime event. At least we hope it's once in a lifetime. So we now have 1.5 million cases here in the United States. We're both the leader in the number of cases as well as the number of those of our citizens claimed by the disease. Globally, 322,000 people have died. In the United States, we crossed over 90,000. We're now at 91,730, with a prediction that by June, we will cross 100,000 dead as a result of this pandemic. So there's a graph that John and I wanted to show you that's kind of indicative of where we are. If you click on the United States and click on daily cases, you see that this is the massive cases in the United States is on a gradual decline now. However, when you compare this graph of decline to what we're seeing in the hardest hit countries in Europe, who had very, very strict measures implemented after their health systems were initially overwhelmed. John, if you could bring up Italy. So Italy was where we began to see, the healthcare system overwhelmed, the resources of their certain regions, especially like Lombardy, and also in the south, Foggia. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly for my colleague in Italy who has been sharing her experience there. And the decline is obviously much more dramatic over the same period of time as ours is right now. So we have a lot to learn from successful mitigation in countries like Italy and South Korea. And even before mitigation, there are countries like Taiwan and New Zealand that succeeded in containment. So in epidemiology, we have two responses to pandemic that are the two initial responses. Obviously, one is containment, finding patient zero, tracking and tracing, and then obviously, tamping down on the further spread of it as early as possible. And what that does, obviously, is allow us not to have to go to the next phase, which is mitigation. Now, mitigation is where you have failed at containment, and now you have to go forward with, addressing the public health imperative by asking people to stay away from each other, to stay home, shutting down businesses, as we're clearly have seen here in the United States. So John, zooming in on our location here in Pennsylvania, which is in northeastern Pennsylvania near the Pocono Mountains. Our county is a hotspot, and that's a result of our proximity to northern New Jersey, which is obviously related to the outbreak that occurred in the greater metropolitan area of New York City. So we also have the crossing of the two major arteries, Route 81 and 80, very close by, and this traffic through here is enormous. We have significant traffic between our area and the metropolitan northern New Jersey area of a specific ethnicity. The Hispanic community has a large presence here in our county, and they have a lot of family and businesses that they do commerce with back and forth. So our particular location has resulted in this transit of the virus in larger numbers than our neighboring counties. So that's what's going on. Does anyone have any questions on the counts or how this is, how what we look compared to the rest of the world, and what our declination curve, basically our decline in cases daily means. As John said, all you have to do is unmute yourself, and you can ask questions at any time. Am I still muted? Please tell me now.
You're good.
Okay. All right. So what you saw on that map was just the case counts, right? So what molecular biologists and epidemiologists look at, which is of more significance to them, is how the virus has spread and mutated. And these mutations give us a very strong indication of where the virus has traveled to, and what it has learned or picked up along the way molecularly. And so what John's showing you right now is a website called NextStrain, where they're able to plot, based on the data they've accumulated from the genomics of these viruses that have been taken from samples and sequenced. They're able to plot basically what they believe has happened over the course of time. John, if you scroll down a little bit and past the diversity. Yeah, just scroll down there. There you go. So you'll see that right there is mapped out the entire, I'm sorry, up a little bit, John. Yeah, those colors indicate the various genes that are encoded in the 30,000 base pairs. By comparison, the human being has 3 billion base pairs, and we have around 24,500 genes that are known to have function at this time. It may be up to 29,000, I'm not sure, but anywhere between 25 and 30,000 genes have been identified in the human genome. We have identified 29 significant genes in the viral genome. So there's a huge, orders of magnitude difference in the complexity. This is a very simple virus. It is what's known as a positive sense RNA virus. Their viruses are divided into DNA and RNA. RNAs are the simple ones, and because they're simple, they actually have a tendency to mutate more rapidly. In a pandemic event like this, the longer you allow the virus to spread throughout a population, the more opportunity it has for mutation, and then the harder it becomes to start to develop a comprehensive strategy. So, that includes, it may make it harder to develop a vaccine the longer this is allowed to, develop its own more strains. And one of the things that we learned that was very interesting in the last month is that the infections on the West Coast were due to a completely different strain than the infections on the East Coast here in the United States. So what John is doing here is running through the timescale of the emergence out of Wuhan, and you can see the spread of the purple the initial locus of infection and where it goes. And we have a question from Karen, and I will cover that. Ask her to ask it in just a moment. So here we go. This is the travel of the virus from the center over the time scale to May, right at the edge of the circle here. And the various colors represent the various strains and where they emerged, where they traveled to and emerged in the pandemic. So anyone have any questions about this before I go to the counts? Why this is important? This is important to epidemiologists and all of us that are tracking it at the molecular level. But obviously this also relates to counts, and the crossover between this and counts will allow us to understand which strains are the most easily spreading, which ones may be the most virulent, based on the location, which strains are causing the most case fatality, or we have different measures of mortality and case fatality, et cetera. So this gives us a better picture than just the raw case counts. Okay, so let's unmute Karen and get her question. Karen Kirsch, correct? Pronounce that right?
Yep, that's right. So Secretary Azar said that there was no spike in the states that opened up early. Mm-hmm. Of course, I went online and immediately looked at things, and there were people in Texas that were claiming that that's not true, that cases are going up. So I'm wondering, is there a different definition of what a spike is? Georgia opened up about 3 weeks ago, and I think Texas opened up April 30th or May 1st. So I'm wondering if that's indeed true. And I did see something about some data coming out of Texas was not put in chronological order, or no, coming out of Georgia was not put in chronological order.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
As well, which is a little bit shocking to me. So could you address those two things?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so there's if you've been coming to these town halls, I try to explain everything with a short answer and a long answer and a histogram in between. So the short answer to the question that you initially posed is, yes, there are spikes, and those that are trying to urge us to reopen the economies of our states and then try to reintegrate into our societies, they have a way of describing the data as anomalous, right? So it's been declining for 15 days or 10 days or 12 days, and then there's a sudden rise, and that to them is just an anomaly. But to us, who are looking at it clinically and epidemiologically, it's actually something is much more concerning, and that is definitely what we describe as reopen the economies of our states and then try to reintegrate into our societies. They have a way of, John, we've got a big delay. Sorry about that. Anyway, so it is, any spike, if you don't see, if you see the Italy graph, there's day-to-day discrepancies, but the linear regression is on decline, all right? For us, that's enough. For biostatisticians and those that are really examining, the details of this, they have to find explanations, and those have to do with staffing and all this other stuff. But as long as we're seeing a very significant day-to-day decline, anything that blips up at the end of that is significant, okay? It's significant because we know that the incubation period for this, which I was mistakenly calling it latency, but anyway, semantics. The incubation period for this could be as short as 3 to 4 days, where 3 to 4 days after you have exposure to someone with this virus, you can start developing the symptoms, or it could be as long as 14 to 21 days. Okay, So if you've had this 14-day decline, and then all of a sudden you let people, begin to reintegrate, that blip is actually coming from somewhere back there. All right. So somewhere back there, there was a failure in the containment and the strategies of mitigation. All right. So the longer that decline is allowed to take, 14, 21, 30 days, with less of the spikes along the way, the more confidence that you have that containment is working. If all of a sudden after 14 days, you're like, okay, let's go, everybody go to the bars and everybody, go to the restaurants, then you're going to see these. You're going to see these emerge. And it's not necessarily a result of reopening on that date. It's a result of not waiting long enough. Okay? Some would argue that it's both. That some would argue that you reopen and 3 days later you see this, or 3 days after a protest where everyone showed up without masks, you'll see this. That may be also true. Okay? That may very well be also true. As far as that's the that's the semi-short answer. I guess the longer answer is that we don't have a unified national strategy. The states have been allowed to make their own decisions as to how and when to reopen. The CDC guidance has not been implemented the same way by all the states, and therefore you will see certain states succeed at reopening, and you'll see inevitably you'll see other states fail at it. It is what we expect. Okay. Before this, when John and I were setting up, one of the important lessons from Italy was that for at least January and February, not many national governments at the national level were taking the pandemic threat seriously. When Italy began to get its healthcare system overwhelmed, when patients were dying on respirators, when they were running out of respirators, when the death counts on a daily basis in a particular region were, the first time it crossed 300 in a day or crossed 500 in a day, then that was the alarm bell, right? So I think the alarm bell for us in this reintegration will be looking at states that have rushed forward to experiment with their economies having to, deal with all of this, and whether or not they have appropriately given guidance to people in these workplaces on how to protect themselves and their clients. Unfortunately, their failures are going to teach the states that waited longer, they're going to teach those states those lessons. So there's that. I hope maybe I answered the question.
No, you did.
Okay.
I guess as far as Georgia is concerned, how the chronological error is that?
That's just poor reporting. I mean, as far as I understand it, that is just very sloppy. Again, all of these health departments at the state level, if they had a standard protocol, then for reporting, if they had a standard way of assigning, that to the doctors and the healthcare systems in their state, look, this is what we need from you when we get a report of a death. How did you determine the patient died of COVID? When did you determine it? Was it pre-admission? Was it, and then how? Obviously, how? What kind of test allowed you to say that this patient was COVID? Because the variety of tests and evidence that is being brought forward to determine that a patient has COVID is unbelievably varied. Okay. It could be the swab test, or they'll forego the swab test and they'll do a chest x-ray. The chest x-ray, is showing, pneumonia, or it's a CT scan that's showing the pathognomic ground glass appearance. then there's no testing. There's no molecular testing. They've just said, okay, this is definitely COVID. Move them to the COVID ward or move them to the ICU and put them under containment. So if we had a national guidance to say, okay, everyone, listen, this is how we need you to diagnose these patients. And then everybody did that, or 99% of people did that, then we would have cleaner data. Right now we have chronologically poorly curated data. We have molecularly poorly curated data. We have clinically poorly curated data, and which each level of complexity, adding confounding data, the reporting is going to be unreliable. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Basically, our picture is skewed a little bit because the feds aren't really standardizing things.
Yeah, and look, we're not alone. So let's also look at the UK. We spoke to a doctor from the UK a couple weeks ago who says that even NHS, which is held up as a paragon of of central medical excellence, trying to do evidence-based medicine, trying to establish kind of a standard of medical excellence across all these disciplines, even held up as a paragon throughout the world as the way to potentially do healthcare the right way. They have failures, big failures, big failures. France, Italy is ranked the third best healthcare system in the world. I'm sorry, in Europe. We have success stories in Germany, but again, like I talked about in the very beginning of this town hall, if you're good at containment, then you won't have to get to the point where you start being bad at mitigation. Okay. We blew through containment, as did all of the European countries. And then they struggled with doing mitigation properly. So we're not alone. The United States is not the only country that has shown that it's not good at this. The country that's shown that it's good at this is South Korea, because they actually had to go into past containment and into mitigation. They did mitigation well. New Zealand and Taiwan didn't get there. They just stopped it at containment, right? So what that does is it buys you time to get your apparatus right. Your public health apparatus needs to have track and trace. It has to have standardization. It has to have protocols. We didn't have any of those. Neither did the European countries. So, and we still don't. While we're seeing European countries begin to standardize, we are about, just as we were in March, we're about 2 to 3 weeks behind they are. So not only in the addressing of and treating the patients, right? We're also behind in standardizing. We're also behind in establishing protocols. We're also behind in track and trace. So, it is easy and expeditious to try and lay blame at the federal level, where there's plenty, but we're not alone. So, okay, let's keep going. I do need to, John, can you catch up on questions?
Sure. I think that one of the questions that is, I will summarize about 6 questions.
Okay.
In kind of answering that, there are a lot of questions about what the proper methodology is, what you feel should be counted, what shouldn't be counted. Sandra says in Pennsylvania, there's a concern that if somebody is in a nursing home in Lackawanna County, but they originally resided in Luzerne County, that they're counted twice.
Yeah.
And I think that, these are all valid concerns of which we have no answers on the accuracy of that
Yeah, yeah. Well, so, one of the things I must press for is that not everybody there isn't a single person that has all the answers. Okay. So even, Dr. Rachel Levine, who has outstanding background, she can't be expected to have all the answers to all of these things. There has to be a team. All right. And the team also has to have some experience. So, the question is there double counting? Likely. Is there undercounting? Extremely likely. Extremely likely. Is there a lack of, a single definition of whether a patient died of COVID or not? Absolutely. Okay. So let me just try to summarize a conversation that I had online recently with two data guys. All right. I mean, these are hardcore data guys. And they have a background in statistics. They have a background in molecular biology. And so they're able to discuss this from somewhat of a multidisciplinary perspective. And I added the clinical perspective. So, we've tried to talk, this is important. We tried to get one definition, okay? There right now is what you see on that Johns Hopkins map that John showed earlier is what we call case fatality, all right? It's the number of deaths in the country over the number of positive COVID cases. It's an extremely crude and rough estimate, all right? And because it's crude and rough, you'll see case fatality percentages as high as 14% in a country like Italy. You'll see them as low as 0.5% in Germany, okay, case fatality. Then there's a more stringent definition called infection fatality rate, all right? So infection fatality rate is the deaths confirmed by the presence of antibodies. So this person didn't just get a nose and blah, 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 and maybe, and chest X, well, it's COVID by diagnosis, and they went, none of that. This is definitive. They had the antibody for this virus, which means they were definitely infected, and they died. Okay. So again, much more specific, and that infection fatality rate, it can be debated, is actually between 0.8% and 1.5%. All right. So where is there some failure there? There's some failure in the fact that the test itself for antibodies may not be specific enough. Okay. If it's not 95 or between 95 and 100, if it's not above that, and if not everyone was tested with the exact same test, then there's going to be flaws in the infection fatality rate, in my opinion. And we can have somebody who has a better biostats background debate that. And finally, there's mortality, okay? Mortality is, in my opinion, the multidimensional, multidisciplinary approach. And what it says is, patient came to the hospital for COVID symptoms. It was confirmed by any of the above methods that the patient has COVID. The patient died. During the course of the disease in the hospital, the patient died. Okay? That mortality rate in the United States is estimated to be 1.5%. Okay? So for every 1,000 people, right? 15 people, 1,000 people get it, 15 people will die. I think that's correct. So these definitions are not being implemented with a national standard in all of the states. So the case counts are not standardized. The fatality and the is not standardized. So these are the problems we're facing with numbers. Now, let's just say that we're off by 10%. That's a big margin of error. In statistics, 10% is like walking around with one eye, all right? in terms of the visibility of the data and accuracy of the data. 10% margin of error is bad. All right. If 10% of is in error, we've still lost 80,000 people to this disease in 3 months. So I'm not sure what it is that we are achieving by necessarily debating or criticizing data collection. All I want is as much data as possible, okay? Even if it's dirty, we'll clean it. But as far as the case counts, if there was a suspected COVID patient that died, we want to know. If there was a patient that recovered and thought that they had COVID, we want to know. The more data, the better. That's with any disease, it is inevitable. We just have to assemble the data, and then we have methods to normalize it and to clean it. So
anyway. Question. If somebody comes in, and Carol had posted this in the chat, a cause of death might be pneumonia, but the patient had HIV. So is their cause of death pneumonia? Is their cause of death complications due to HIV infection? And does that parallel over to what we're experiencing now with the data with COVID-19? If someone comes in,
there's a definite parallel. This happened to us in the 90s, right? People were dying of opportunistic infections, many of whom didn't even know that they had HIV, right? Until they ended up in the hospital, or even after that. So they had an autopsy done, and the HIV viral titer was done, and then discovered that the patient had, all of these opportunistic infections and died as a result of the opportunistic infections. No doubt about it. There's no doubt that the opportunistic infections killed them, but they wouldn't have had those opportunistic infections if they didn't have HIV. So what are we debating here? If the patient arrived as a result of the deterioration of their health, being, COVID, then they are an important part of the count, right? What we can and we should, in medical circles, debate the appropriate assignment of cause of death when it comes to these patients. But to say, well, they died of pneumonia alone, without questioning whether they would have died of pneumonia without ever having been infected, I'm not exactly seeing the point of that debate.
Based on absolutely no actual knowledge of what I'm about to say, which will have a caveat for anything that I ever say. Just let's leave that. I would imagine that some death certificates or some of that will have a primary, secondary, tertiary cause of death.
Yes.
And some will just have one line, depending on, is it municipality, state, country, whatever.
Right.
Is that accurate?
It is accurate. And in fact, it would be great if the state secretaries of health all agreed to a simple standard. Okay, from Oregon to Maine, if everybody could just agree that the first line should be the cause of death, that is, the pathophysiology that led to the cause of death. That could be cardiac arrest, that could be congestive heart failure, whatever. Okay, just the actual cause of death, pathophysiologically. Now, if they were positive for COVID, could go on the second line. All right, and that's my opinion. I would need my opinion corroborated by epidemiologists and others that are involved in this. But from my understanding of community and social medicine, from my understanding of hospital medicine and all of these definitions that go along with, we call them key performance indicators in hospital medicine. The average length of stay, morbidity, mortality, complication rates. We have like 114 key performance indicators that we monitor on a day-to-day basis in hospitals. And the critically important is a single standard, a single definition. So you can compare quality across hospitals. All right. One thing we will start to do maybe a year from now is look at how different hospitals and healthcare systems handled the exact same types of COVID patients. Where were the high, achieving hospitals that had the ultimately the best or shortest length of stay, the least admissions to ICU of these COVID patients, that addressed their cytokine storm early, that, what were the details that created, positive deviance for these patients, and what were the things that were failures that created death. Okay, so definitionally, if that's even a word, we would prefer for everybody to agree to just do it one way, and it's not, again, there's no purpose in I don't see the purpose in disagreeing.
All right. Now that we are back, we want to move on to our next area where we talk about some updates. We've got a lot of new people on today. We got 23 people on the Zoom alone. Another, I don't know how many on the Facebook feed.
All right, this is your fault, John. You made me popular. This is all your fault. So,
okay. So we want to talk about some things, and I've asked Dr. Udoshi to give us some background on each area that we update on. And the first area we want to update on is, where do we stand with testing? But first, what are the different types of tests, and then where do we stand?
Sure, great. Thank you, John. Okay, so and then we need to catch up on questions. So if you could look in the Zoom group chat for questions that I've missed, and I will explain what John asked me to explain just now. Okay, testing.
Okay.
So testing is really important as part of an overall strategy, and John and I will go over Sanjay's plan to reopen or get America back on its legs in a little bit. But testing is a critical part of this, and it's kind of sad for me because I see all these kids and I have kids, and this camp is closed, and that opportunity to be with other kids is closed, and people are canceling their vacations and all of that. And there is something that we could do to kind of get back our lives faster, and that is instead of making assumptions. And I discussed this with one of my friends here, Sandra, about the fact that it is quite unfair, and she noted that it's unfair that the entire county is locked down when it's really one locality within that county that's housing the maximal number of positive cases. Okay. Why is it that we can't get more granular and try to do what South Korea did, which is like, oh, there's 2 cases in that neighborhood, boom, everybody like within a certain radius of that neighborhood gets tested, and their travel history, their how many friends they've talked to in the last 25 days, they get called, and how you feeling every day. They did it right, okay? And we're not. We're doing it kind of in a gross manner, all right? Luzerne County, everybody all the businesses stay closed until June, when actually nobody north of a certain line has tested positive for it. I'm trying to make this simple. So testing is critically important to get granular. And the other model that I wanted to bring forward before I explain the different types of testing is the New Zealand model, which is asking the citizenry to take responsibility themselves. So Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, she's got an outstanding team. She has a great health minister, and they came up with this concept called your bubble, right? You define your bubble for yourself. My bubble is Karen, my wife, my 2 children, okay? And the lady down the street where I buy my gas, and the kids that I've only let to come over this week. We hadn't seen them in 5 weeks. So I've defined this bubble. I don't let anyone into that bubble that I don't know. All right. So I'm not having people come over and work on my house, or I'm sorry, inside my house or on my yard or anything. I'm not allowing myself to be in contact with more than these number of people. This is my bubble, because I don't know, there's no confidence that my next door neighbor who works, as a tradesman and goes all over the area, in and out of houses, essential worker. I don't know. As much as I know him and I love him, I have to be responsible enough to protect my bubble. Now, if I knew, but let's just say crude example, everybody that got tested negative puts a red sticker on their, or blue or green sticker on their mailbox and says, everybody in this house has been tested, we're all negative. Okay. That only changes if their status changes. How much more confidence do I have to let my neighbors come over for burgers and go over their house for burgers? And I'm just giving you a crude example. Okay. This isn't even clinically based, but it is based in certain epidemiological methods of track and trace. There is the balance. There is a balance that has to be considered between personal privacy and the invasiveness of your own information getting to people who may have nefarious intent, and not the intent that actually I would hope some of us would trust our local health or our national and state health authorities with having our best interests in mind. If we had that trust, we could trust them with our data. Maybe we don't. But testing is necessary. So I gave you the granular my bubble level. Now let's expand this. So the only way to know that everybody in your neighborhood has not had is not positive for COVID is to have them all tested. Their status may change in a week to 2 weeks to a month, depending on how many people they let into their bubble, or so if my bubble is this big, but my neighbor's bubble is this big, there's discrepancy. If his bubble is big, but everybody's tested and negative, there's safety. So what are the tests? Nasal swab test, okay? It is a test that looks for the fingerprint at the molecular level in the form of RNA of this virus, only this virus. How do we know it's only this virus? How do we know it's not another coronavirus, or it's not a rhinovirus or an adenovirus that's sitting there and I just have this, whatever, it's sitting there and I get tested? Well, what we look for is something that's called a highly conserved region, all right? A highly conserved region, and you saw the thing that we showed you earlier on the next strain with the little colors of the different genes. We're gonna look for that particular sequence of RNA that exists only in, because we've sequenced it, we know, only in SARS-CoV-2. It's called a highly conserved sequence or region. So we have our methods, our reagents, our tests. We put the nasal swab, and the first generation ones needed you to go all the way back into the back of the nasopharynx. Now we can just swab the nose, internal part of the nose. Other tests are coming forward where you'll be able to, swab your mouth and all this other stuff, but it's getting simpler and more efficient and less hard to do. We take that, we dissolve away all the stuff that's not RNA. We run the test in a machine called a reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction machine, RT-PCR, little box, cycle, blah, amplifies, and lights up if there's viral RNA detected. All right, that's the whole process. And if it's not there, then nothing lights up. All right. I'll get back to this and the problems associated with that in a minute. But that is currently the available test to detect whether you are carrying the virus.
And generally, Sanjay, that's the test you get if you go to a Walgreens or a Rite Aid or a drive-through testing site, correct?
Until recently, that test has only been really available to people who say that they're feeling sick, or who have been in contact or are taking care of people who are feeling sick, okay? As of the last week or so, or 2 weeks, you can now go and get a test, even if you are what we call asymptomatic, which means you don't feel sick, but you just want to know if you're carrying it because you want to know. And the reason we all want to know whether you're carrying it is because if you're carrying it, again, the hypothesis is that there are some people that carry it, never get sick, and that could be shedding it during the period that they are carrying it, or they're carrying it and will get sick, and they're shedding it during the period that they're carrying it. And this is going back to Karen's question. This is how spikes come back. After your whole region has seen a declination of case counts, and then someone is asymptomatically carrying this and goes to the Starbucks and orders has a conversation with their buddy without a mask on, and it falls on the table, and then someone else comes along, puts their coffee down, accidentally puts their hand on the same table where someone was, talking, and then they, instead of washing their hands or following these simple things to protect themselves, they end up touching their face, touching their nose, rubbing their eye, and they get sick. And so the person who might have been carrying, if they had been tested or had the availability of the test, and also the people who feel sick that should know whether they have it or not, they should avail of that swab test. Before I move on to antibody test, does anyone have a question on, okay, so Lauren Roberts asked, what if there's a mutation in the highly conserved region? Very good question. And the the answer to that is very complicated. We're already seeing that, out of the 8 strains, there are 30 significant mutations. Whether or not our current test, and the reason for which, the reason may be that what the point you just brought up, for it being, for false negatives being reported, is that, that highly conserved region that we were looking for had changed. Okay, in that particular strain, in that particular patient, if it had changed, then it would come back negative, and that patient could very well still have or fall ill from COVID, even though they got a nasal swab test that showed that they didn't have it. Okay, I hope I have helped with that one. What type of test is the most accurate and comprehensive thus far, Sandra? I love her questions. So to be honest, like the first generation of tests was terrible. I mean, we're getting on average 27% false negatives. A false negative means you have it, but the test says that you don't. Okay, 27% is almost a third. So across the country, if we had deployed, the CDC test with almost 30% coming back false negative, that means we were missing a lot of people, too many. All right. So the second generation test comes out, and this was addressed. The underlying reasons for error were addressed. And we're seeing a lot better what we call sensitivity. Okay, we're seeing that the sensitivity has gone up from 73% to over 95%. So the swab tests that you're getting now are much more reliable and accurate than they were. And that is most likely because we have found the regions that are better to test for, the RNA that's better to test for. Okay, but let me finish with Sanders' question. The most accurate test, accurate has a definition, but let's just use that word. The most accurate test to determine whether someone has the disease right now is the swab test. The most accurate way to know whether a patient had the disease, meaning they got sick, 4 to 6 weeks later they want to know whether they had it, is what we call the antibody test. All right, so there's a lot of variability, and again, variability is a result of all of this being new to so many labs, and the rate of processing being the bulk and the rate of processing being so high results in greater error. But antibody tests. So antibody tests are, John, do you want to bring up that slide of the IgM, IgG? Okay, and while you're bringing that up, Sanders' follow-up was, can people simply request a specific type of test, or do we get whatever the medical team has on hand? So Sanders, I hope I made that clear. If you are presenting to the medical team because you want to know whether you are carrying the virus, because you potentially might be carrying the virus as a result of having a family member that you've been taking care of that was sick, or your workplace being, high traffic, or any of the reasons that you have risk factors for contracting the disease, but you're not feeling sick right now, it's a nasal swab test. Okay. If you are feeling sick, again, the team is going to give you the nasal swab test. The nasal swab test is really the test that's going to be your initial contact test with any medical care team. The antibody test is not for now. The antibody, in terms of the immediacy of an answer, the antibody test is what we're trying to use for patients that have said that they were sick, weeks ago, and we want to know because we didn't have the tests available to them, they didn't get tested while they were sick, all of that. We want to know whether it was actually COVID. Okay. All right. Karen has a specific test question about where they found virus in the Italy autopsies. Karen, your question is next. Hold that thought. Okay. Complicated graph, but I'm going to try to simplify this for you. Antibodies do not show up until you are infected. Okay. So an antibody is specific, and it is produced by your white blood cells, by your immune system, specifically by a cell called the B cell. The coordination of the immune system is by white blood cells called T cells. What happens is the virus consists of protein, the spikes that you've seen, little red spikes, and a bilipid layer, and inside is the RNA. There's other proteins embedded in that ball. So it comes in contact with the white blood cells of your body, and the white blood cells successfully ingest and break apart the virus. And then they go through a process where they start to show the rest of the white blood cells in the body, this is what this infectious agent looks like. Let's gear up for the fight, okay? And then at that stage, the B cells, plasma cells, they say, okay, let's do this. The ones that are reactive with the virus, the ones that produce antibodies that are reactive and neutralizing with the virus, they go into overdrive. They start producing antibodies in large quantity. Antibodies are not a monolithic thing. They have different classes and they have different purposes. but there's 5 classes. Let's only talk about 2, okay? So IgM is a class of antibody that will show up early, all right, and then it will start to dissipate late. So it starts to dissipate. It shows up early, it dissipates early. It's the purple dotted line. But what's more important than IgM, which is only involved in the initial response to the virus, is this curve that we see in dotted line green, right? In that dotted line green, these are what we call protective antibodies, all right? These are the antibodies we're looking for. These are the antibodies we're looking for. Sorry, that was terrible. So these are the antibodies we're looking for, and the antibody test for detecting whether you had exposure and have recovered with after exposure and sickness to COVID is the IgG, all right? So right now, Quest Diagnostics, and then there's a couple of other ones, GenoLight in San Diego and some others, that are offering at cost to do the antibody test. Why would you get one? Well, one of my good friends, a number of my good friends, but one who's on the call right now with us, had the test and is negative. And another one also had the test, Mike. So Terry has had the test, Mike has had the test, and others who have contacted me have had the test. So I don't want to get into the problems with it right now. I'll just say there's some problems with it. But this is the science behind it. Once these labs start getting it right, it will become more reliable. And then we need this because this is a good time as any to discuss one of my most recent posts. We need to learn what we call the seroprevalence. The seroprevalence in the New York, New Jersey area is approaching between 10 and 15% as the last data that I saw, 10 or 15%. That means within a certain locality in the northern New Jersey and New York metropolitan area, over the last, let's say 4 months, at least 10 to 15% of the population may have been exposed and may have antibodies. Why is that important? It's important because to achieve what we call herd immunity, where we can really see the effectiveness of this virus to replicate itself and cause disease, we need to have 80% herd immunity. My most recent post was about how Sweden has not taken the same control approach with containment or mitigation as the rest of Europe. Because of adopting a strategy of isolating the most vulnerable, which includes their elder population, and allowing their society to continue working as it usually does, their rate of seroprevalence already may be as high as 20%. That means a lot of people in Sweden have gotten sick. They weren't tested, blah, blah, blah. We don't know, all that stuff. But we do know that in their elder population, they have a 10 times higher mortality, death rate than their neighbors, Finland and Norway. Scientifically, this approach will result in their population achieving herd immunity, theoretically, faster than any of their European neighbors, okay? That's theoretically. It comes at the cost of many other aspects of public health, because we know that not only do these people recover and get antibodies about 80% of the time, we also know that about 10 to 15% of people that recover will carry with them what we call morbidity, which is long-term consequences of having been sick. So that results in all kinds of other issues. Like they're not just going to cost Sweden's economy now, having gotten sick and gotten better, but they're going to cost Sweden's economy because they have reduced lung function due to fibrosis. They have increased cardiac issues. They may have chronic renal failure. They may have other sequelae that keeps them from being normal, productive members of society if they had not gotten the disease. So, we got 1.3 million in the United States that have, well, this was last week. So we have 1.5 million in the United States that have been confirmed positive. We know that 1.5% will die. That we can debate. I don't understand why we need to debate it. But for us in this town hall, let's just say 1.5% are going to die. Or, some 90,000 have already died. 12% as an average between 10 and 15 are going to suffer long-term consequences of having been sick. And that means that they're going to be, to use the lack of a better word, they're going to be a burden. They're going to be a burden to the economy. They're going to be a burden to sorry guys, hang on. Hang on, sorry. Sorry about that. Camera died. So they're going to be a burden to the economy. They're going to be a burden to their healthcare systems because they have more long-term diseases that they carry with them. Okay. All right. John, you got to do a better job with the comments because I can't even keep up.
We got them all.
We did? You sure?
In some form, there were a lot of duplicate questions. So.
Okay.
So I think we're
guys, is he right? If he's not right, then unmute and challenge him.
I have a question, Sanjay, about antibodies. So I had the antibody test. I got it from Quest. I actually was able to get it from an online telehealth provider fairly easily. And it was negative, which wasn't too surprising. I, figured I could have maybe been exposed, but wasn't sure. But my question is about the innate immune, I don't have the language here, so I apologize, but I'll do my best. It goes to Heather's question, which is basically, does a negative antibody test mean, is it equivalent to saying that you've had no exposure? The thing that I'm questioning is there this period that you showed on that graph where, is it possible for the innate immune system or the sort of brute force immune system to actually deal with an exposure in a way that does not result in the body creating antibodies?
Great question. So that's something I've been investigating, and the answer to that is debatable or not exactly known. Okay, so I was trying to get as much information as I could before today, but for the last few days, speaking to a molecular biologist and to other physicians, and to someone who has, I think, more immunology experience than I do. Again, I haven't been able to fully cultivate that friendship with them yet, but we were talking about this on a couple of threads. And so let's simplify it down to the basics. When the virus comes into contact with your nose or oral cavity or even the conjunctive of your eye, the virus then has an opportunity to, the basic word is infect. So it attaches to the ACE2 molecule, which is on the surface of all of these epithelial cells. It is brought into the cell, and all viruses have one of two ways of replicating. One's called the lysogenic one is called the lysogenic cycle, and one is called the lytic cycle. So lysogenic is that it comes into the cell and it interjects its genetic material into your genetic material. okay? And then it can sit there for a unknown amount of time. The incubation period for that, and we saw this with HIV, it is so variable and nearly impossible to truly nail down as a predictable time period in some cases, in some viruses. Now, in coronavirus, in SARS-CoV-2, it is not a retrovirus, so it does not insert itself into your genetic material. Instead, it gets into your cell, it hijacks the material, the machinery of your cell. So it exposes its RNA, and your cell's machinery thinks that is just, normal RNA, and that we should do with it what we usually do, which is create protein from it and, do the other things the other genes tell us to do. And then by doing that, your cells are creating, they turn into the factory for this virus, okay? So they create more and more viruses, more and more viruses. The cell fills up with virus, and then the cell is, lyses. And this is the lytic cycle. The cell lyses, breaks open, and all kinds of intracellular material, along with huge amounts of virus, spill out. And as it spills out, it gives the virus huge opportunity to continue its life cycle elsewhere. Okay, so then it infects the cell next door and down, down into your nasopharynx, and sometimes that can take 3 days to infect you to the point where you have, significant signs and symptoms. It could take 14 days, maybe it could take longer than that. That's the basics of the infection with coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. Is there perhaps a scenario where it doesn't go inside of your cell, but it resides, the inoculum, what we call the initial viral inoculum, the amount and concentration of virus that was foreign to your body, that went inside and sat inside of your nasal cavity, may have drifted into your sinuses with the secretions, may have just sat in the back of your oropharynx without going through its cycle. How long can it last there? And does that elicit, like you asked, does that elicit the immune response? Now, the first thing I described to you definitely elicits an immune response. The cell, before it dies, does have the tendency to tell the cells around it that it's diseased. It does have a tendency to tell the white blood cells along the blood vessels that are adjacent to it, something's wrong here, okay? And this is the cell signaling cytokines that you may have heard, cytokines. They are a molecular signal to the blood cells, white blood cells, your immune system. Come here, something's wrong, check this out, okay? That's the start of your immune response. Then T cells become involved, and then B cells become involved, and that's the curve you see, okay? That's, 10 to 12 days, you get the IgM production, and then 12 to 14 days, you'll get the IgG production, and then the whole thing is, as I described it before. That's when they're detectable, okay? It sounds like, now, can you tell me more about your illness?
I didn't particularly have. I'm hyper health conscious, so I'm likely to just have been noticing some tiny aberrations. I didn't have anything that really resembled an illness. I was just more curious. I had a secondary sort of contact who, my cleaning person worked for someone who was diagnosed, and so I knew there was some potential for having had an exposure, but. No, I don't have any particular reason to think that I had it. I also believe that I have a really strong I haven't had a flu or a cold in 5 years probably. So I feel as though whatever my immune system is doing, it's doing it effectively and efficiently. And I just wonder how this is exactly what you're talking about that I've been so interested in. So thank you.
Okay, welcome.
Thanks for the question. Our next question is from Carrie, and it's about strains or different variants.
Mhm.
Can there be co-infection or reinfection due to exposure to different strains, and how might that affect regions? So the West Coast strain and the East Coast strains. And I think back this up a little bit. I'm going to toss up this slide we have on what a strain is, so we can kind of get that as a foundation for the rest of the answer. If I could find that slide. There it is. Here we go. This is lots of fun. There's like 27 people messaging me.
See?
Yep, we will hire more help for next week. Okay, next. There we go.
All right. So, yeah. Okay. So, what question am I answering here, John?
Can somebody have strain? Can somebody have European strain?
Yes.
And somebody have
infected.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
At the same time, and it's going to come back to the question that I don't know that we know the answer of, is there antibody protection from different strains? And I think you answered that before.
Well, somewhat. So let me make it more clear. If you suffered from the East Coast strain, okay, the antibodies that your body produced may not protect you from what happened out in Oregon, Washington, on the West Coast. Okay, it may not protect you. The reason is that let me go over the definitions. So, what are mutations and what are strains and what are variants? You're going to hear a lot of this, and they're people use them without properly, understanding what they are. Okay, so a mutation or a mutant is, it's the same species, same virus, but it's specifically distinctive, meaning that an S protein that looks like this, okay, on what we call wild type or normal, or the original virus, suddenly goes like this. There's a protein conformational change on that that spike protein. Same spike protein, does the same thing, is pretty much functionally equivalent to the original virus, but the mutant has something that is a result of an error. Because it's such a simple virus, RNA has a tendency to pick up errors. RNA viruses don't have the corrective correction, what we call proofreading proteins, that more advanced organisms have to keep their genome, as it should be. So these mutants arise as a result of huge numbers of replication cycles, and somehow that spike protein that used to look like this looks like this all of a sudden. Does all the same stuff, but there's a little error in it and it looks different. And that could happen to the S protein, it can happen to the envelope protein, it can happen to the RNA dependent RNA polymerase, or whatever proteins that this RNA thing codes for. It's a mutant. A strain is same species, same everything's, it's the same organism, but it's genetically distinctive because of a set of mutations. Okay, not just one, but a set of mutations. So it has a set of mutations that result in it looking different under a microscope, or acting different in terms of its virulence. All right, so it instead of having a 3-day incubation period, this strain may have a 10 or 12 or 15-day incubation period. Why? We got to figure that out. That's a question to be answered by virologists and molecular biologists. A variant, this is very important. Variant, okay. MERS is a variant. SARS-1 is a variant. H5N1, which is swine flu, is a variant of normal flu. okay, virus. These are variants because they're behaviorally distinctive. They infect anomalously. They're a variant because they go from one organism, like in the case of MERS, the camel was an intermediate vector. In the case of swine flu, the pig was an intermediate vector. Okay, so it's a variant. It's a variant, all right? So this is important to remember. And now back to the answer after being my usual long-winded Sanjay. If you get and recover from this year's New York strain, you may not have protection from next year's Italy strain, or next year's strain that comes from another hard-hit place. Russian travelers may be bringing their own strain in. Asymptomatic carriers could be bringing their strain into the United States. So this is why we have what we call polyvalent vaccines. Monovalent vaccines, polyvalent vaccines, these are terms that we've tried to define before in these town halls. They are multiple strains of the virus are included and packaged into one vaccine, so it will protect you from n number of different strains. In this case, the ideal vaccine for COVID-19, for SARS-CoV-2 will be a polyvalent vaccine that protects you from the 8 strains that are known today. Hi, Terry. What else? Oh.
So just to close the loop on the antibody testing,
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that a negative antibody test is not conclusive proof that you didn't have exposure, but it does say that your infection didn't reach a certain point? Something like that?
Opposite to that.
The opposite.
It's opposite. So it is that you were exposed to it and you had an immune response. So
I said a negative test, but so a positive.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Your answer. Okay.
Sorry. All right. Let's back this up. So if you come back with a negative test, a negative antibody test, that means you did not have an exposure to that virus, and the reason you did not have a exposure to that virus is that immunologically it was never recognized by your body. Okay. Could you have been an asymptomatic carrier of that virus at some point in time? We don't know. All we know is it didn't cause disease and it didn't cause an immunological response if your antibody test is negative.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. But let me cover the positive though. I got to do this, sorry. So if it comes back positive, that means you were infected, okay? Now, why we want to know that you were infected is we would love to ask you questions about that infection. We want to know, was it mild? How long did it last? Where did you travel? Who did you hang out with? All of that. Because the more we know about, even if we don't have, the strain, we don't have the richness of the start to finish clinical history. We'd at least like to know, well, Jesus, you're positive. What happened? Okay, so we can add that to the data set.
I think something that we've talked about in weeks past along the same lines is it'll also give kind of a medical snapshot of the patient or the subject, because we have seen different blood types have different effects. We have seen different ethnicities and races have
we need all
effects.
Of that. Yep.
So all of that information helps the scientists who are working on a vaccine identify common factors between this and other treatments that they may be able to adapt. Karen has a question. Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, so I've seen some stats that said that 40% of the people tested were asymptomatic.
Mm-hmm.
Is that number, is that number a reliable number given that
Okay, tested for what?
for COVID?
No, for how? 40% of
Oh,
what kind of test came back, what, negative?
no. So they came back positive, but they were asymptomatic.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Well, this was the initial, definitely. This was I think in the initial weeks, I think the first 3 to 4 weeks, I kept hearing about patients, but the testing then was flawed. And also the numbers reflected a selection bias that was not useful for us to really discuss. But so rich people were getting tested. Let me just put that way. Okay, rich people that didn't need the test were getting tested, and they were asymptomatic, and they were whatever. Anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is we don't know. We don't know whether there is a large percentage of people that get the swab test. Okay, will never get, who come back positive with the disease, never get the actual illness. We want to know that number. Okay. It could be as high as 30. I haven't heard 40, but I've heard between 20 and 30% of, those who have been tested were potentially asymptomatic carriers.
We just need a bigger sample pool of people being tested to get a good number, basically.
Yeah, and I've been saying this from the beginning. So we're at 5% of our population having been tested, which is great. We need to get to 10% for any of these numbers to make to draw some conclusions about what's going on. Okay, so we're halfway there.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
It's taken us 6 weeks to get here, or 7 weeks. I'm hopeful that we can, with the accelerated pace and greater availability, that in the next 3 to 4 weeks we'll achieve that number. We'll get to 10% of the population, so 30 million. We need 30 million tested.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we need to move on to our next topic. And there's been a lot of discussion about timelines and warp speed.
Yes.
And as a Star Trek fan,
Yes, important.
fan is possibly not an appropriate term. It's sort of an obsession. But anyway, talk to us about vaccines. Where are we at? What do we need? What do we do?
I'd love to, because this is the hopeful part of the thing. But before I do, I want to finish one question. Madeline asked, can anyone who tested positive for antibodies donate plasma for convalescent plasma containing those COVID-19 antibodies? So I will put you guys in touch with a group that is organizing. They're called Survivor Corps. And they have the individual local resources that are doing the collection for convalescent plasma. There are some limitations to who can, a few limitations to who can donate convalescent plasma. They have to do with the types of medications that you may be taking for any chronic diseases. So high concentrations of certain medications preclude you to contribute to that pool. So that's important to know. If you still want to donate convalescent plasma, then they may have to they'll tell you are going to have to go off that medication for 8 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever. And if it is possible for you to go off that medication without detriment to your own health, then you can. And that's obviously something that is individually, you'll have to decide whether you want to do. One thing that I will note is that there's already guidance from those who are collecting the plasma and I believe the FDA issued the guidance that anyone taking Truvada will not be able to donate unless they have been off the medication for at least 12 weeks. Truvada is a prophylactic anti-HIV or prophylaxis against HIV. The list of other medications, I guess John and I will have to assemble and put out onto the resource page, but that's a great question. So those who want to, who've gotten the test back, they're positive for antibodies, they want to contribute because convalescent plasma is definitely showing effectiveness in treating even the most difficult cases of COVID, then we'll put that list out there, connect you with Survivor Corps, and hopefully you'll be able to do that. Okay, now vaccine. With regard to potential vaccine, there are generally, are they generally made in a one-size-fits-all format, or do they select particular vaccine dependent on a person's blood type, race, or other factors? Great question, excellent question. Okay, so now, okay, let's go over the basics, the very basics. So there are 4 types of vaccine that we develop and deploy. The first type is called live vaccine. Live attenuated vaccine is you take the virus and you do something to it so that you have taken away its ability to be a son of a bitch. We call it removal of virulence, okay? And then you introduce the live vaccine that can't cause the disease, and there's lots of reasons why it can't, or the methods of attenuation, but for that, you need to pay me to teach you. So the live vaccine is taken, we attenuate it, we give it to you. So examples of attenuated vaccines are measles, mumps, and rubella, smallpox, chickenpox, and others that are more esoteric, like yellow fever and things like that. Live vaccine, okay? Why do we do this? Because it gives the body a full, what we call a full antigenic picture of the infectious agent. And with that full antigenic picture, you get a long life of protection, okay? So that's one thing. Now, we give that to everyone, all children. These vaccines are deemed, safe for. Again, not going to debate that. So these confer lifelong protection because of that full antigenic picture. The second type is inactivated. So inactivated are where it's a dead thing. It's dead. It can't replicate. It's just dead. It's there. It's somewhat of the full antigenic picture. But it's usually, many strains altogether, like the polyvalent strain of flu vaccine, what else? Hepatitis A, the polio vaccine, rabies. These are vaccines that we can give to you when we've killed the infectious agent, put it in a mechanism for us to give you a shot. All right, then the most recent types are subunit or recombinant, or what we call the bits. Okay, we pull the infectious agent apart. We concentrate what we call the most antigenic pieces of the infectious agent. And antigenic means the ones that are going to make your body's immune system pick up and respond. Okay, so that's going to confer an immediate protection, and it may require a booster. Okay, so that's like Hep B, whooping cough, which is part of DTaP, pneumococcus, so the pneumovax that we give to the elderly, meningococcal disease, meningococcus vaccine, which we recommend for travelers and others and kids. So that's the type of vaccine that we'll probably be producing for COVID. Okay, we're going to rip the thing apart. We're going to get the different strains and figure out how we can package them all together, and we're going to develop a vaccine that confers protection. Now, those vaccines tend to have a curve that goes like this, and as a result of that curve being shorter, instead of the lifelong protection, we have to boost you, or we have to update you with the latest flu vaccine, which is based on the fact that the flu mutates every year, and we have to keep it up to date to make sure that it's protective. Now, whether it's a dirty little secret or not, the flu vaccine confers protection between 42 and 67% of the time. Okay, so it's not a, it's not a guarantee that if you get the flu vaccine that you won't contract the flu this year. There's people obviously, oh, I got the flu vaccine and I got sick anyway. That's true. That happens. Okay. Now, with this COVID disease, it's very likely that we will develop a vaccine that you will have to take yearly or every other year, as we update, as we continue to add the strains that emerge, and have to address a yearly seasonal outbreak or a season of the I don't know, I would prefer to call it, it's flu season. It may be COVID season, I don't know, or SARS season. It sucks, but maybe that is something that we will deal with until we find ways to eradicate it. But that's that. So specifically, this is and will be developed as a seasonal for all vaccine that is not specific to a specific race or sex or age group. So I hope that helps.
Okay, so kind of related to vaccines, which confer some amount of immunity. Let's talk about what is herd immunity. We hear that a lot. Everybody says, why don't we just send everybody back out? Some people will get sick. We'll all have herd immunity and it won't matter anymore. So.
Yeah, okay. All right, so difficult question, very difficult question to answer. And before I answer it, I'll finish with the last question that came across, which was, will this vaccine that we develop be more or less effective than flu vaccine? I think it will be comparable to flu vaccine if we, based on what we've learned in vaccine development, it is possible that it will be more effective. Because if you contrast the complexity of influenza and the complexity of coronavirus, and there's some obvious, there's some molecular biology in there, but my prediction, it will be more effective than the flu vaccine. It will be more effective. Okay, so the question was, John?
Herd immunity.
Thank you. So herd immunity is, tricky. Herd immunity takes time. All right, it's not something that you just say. All right, the worst example of herd immunity is the 500 years it took for us to develop both the methods and inherent immunity to Yersinia pestis. Okay, that was 500 years. So what is Yersinia pestis? That's the plague-causing infectious agent. That was the vector was rats, and it took let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. So yeah, about 18 generations of human beings to develop the adequate amount of herd immunity. The other option, obviously, is with viruses, which have a much shorter incubation period. Much viral generations are much shorter. That may take less time. It may take probably in total 6 to 9 years. If let's say you could just block Sweden off, right, and you could everybody in Sweden just couldn't leave Sweden and just let the virus pass all the way through it, it would take probably 6 to 9 years to build the 80% to 90% herd immunity that would protect them from any further infectivity of the virus. but we don't live in that world. We don't live in a world where any single country can be walled off and allowed to develop its herd immunity independent from any other country. We call them universes, right? We call anything where we're trying to study multivariate phenomenon, we'll put it in a universe. Our universe is this planet when it comes to this virus now, all right? And its behavior is going to be in response to our behavior. If we just let it get through our society, it will take a long time. It will kill a lot of people, and it will scar a lot of people. It is a strategy. Okay, the Israelis have written about it. The Sweden is literally experimenting with it at this point, saying, look, ultimately it's a race down a hill. You can descend slowly, or you can just pull the brakes and just let it go. All right. Their assumption is that the curve that we flattened doesn't change. It just gets spread out. Our method is the same number of people are going to die whether you do anything or not. Okay. So we're just allowing them to die more slowly over time so that our healthcare system doesn't have to invest in morgues and, in the short term. So herd immunity is ideally achieved the way we achieved it with other infectious agents, which is immunization. Okay, immunization is one way to achieve herd immunity rapidly and effectively, and the other way to deal with disease well before herd immunity is to find ways to cut mortality, right? Cut mortality, cut morbidity. Again, morbidity is what you take with you when you've recovered from this disease that is still making you sick in some way or form. If we can cut mortality and morbidity with better treatment, then we are buying ourselves more time. We are allowing ourselves to, reduce the effect it has on our families, our communities, our states, and our country. So that's about herd immunity. I hope I covered that adequately, unless there's more technical questions.
Okay. Next topic that has been in the news that we probably need to discuss, hydroxychloroquine. Yes or no?
All right, but I'm only going to do this if you promise that the next topic is trimodal therapy, because I'd rather spend time talking about what works than what doesn't. All right, so, okay. Again, we can sit here and I can go through paper after paper that I read on a weekly basis about the development of effective therapies and the molecular mechanism of action of drugs that actually we know, are already FDA approved. Hydroxychloroquine is FDA approved. That's a fact. It is used extensively by millions of people to treat arthritis, lupus, and other autoimmune disorders. It has what I call a significant risk profile, which means that it can damage your retina, leading to blindness. It can damage your kidneys, and the dangerous one is it can kill you because it has an effect on the electrical system of the heart, resulting in something we call QT prolongation, which is measured by EKG. All right, so what does that mean? Your heart sends a signal to the heart has two nodes. These are the electrical centers of the heart. It sends these beats, right? And what happens is the drug accumulates quickly in certain people that have inherent cardiac deficiency, and it can cause the heart to just stop listening to those electrical signals and go into cardiac arrest. And then when your heart stops, if there's not a defibrillator nearby, you die. Which makes it really, really dangerous to take outside of a hospital setting, right? At the doses necessary for lupus and arthritis and all these other autoimmune disorders, it's fine, but you need to be monitored for toxicity. People can take it for their entire, their lifelong on this medication because it has certain specific benefits for these patients. Now, whenever we develop a drug now in this era, that drug was developed, 50, 60 years ago. It's a plant derivative, okay? It comes from the bark of a tree. We discovered it because in Africa and in Asia, traditional medicine would take the bark of this tree and extract the oils and dissolve it. And then, you've probably heard of tonic water, quinine water, Schweppes, whatever. This had a protective effect for those who took it regularly. It prevented them from getting a tropical disease called malaria. Malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. All right. So why did this come into, why does nearly everybody who watches the news know the name of this drug today when they knew nothing about it 6 weeks ago? Well, a doctor in Marseille, France, who has long been an advocate of hydroxychloroquine for multiple other infectious disorders and diseases, significant work in malaria, but also thinks that it has other potentiating or depotentiating effects when it comes to infectious disease, tried it on 36 patients who were suffering from COVID. I have his paper. So his Dr. Didier Raoult, all right? So he published this paper, and I read it. And because of somehow this was reported on because there were patients dying, and they were looking for anything that was coming out that was of benefit. Are we still good? Did we lose John?
Oh, I'm here.
Okay. Are we okay? So he 36 patients. He tried it on them. It was an experiment, and then reported that all but 2 of those patients survived. Okay, and then he said that this is likely effective in the treatment of COVID. Unfortunately, he did not mention that not only did he give them hydroxychloroquine, he gave them a standard treatment along with hydroxychloroquine, which we give in the event of fulminant pulmonary infections, called azithromycin. And also, 88% of the patients received ceftriaxone, which is a 4th generation antibiotic, IV. So what we learned from this, we learned about the use of hydroxychloroquine in a press release. What we learned from the paper, which came out 17 days later, is all of these other confounding variables. Between the day of the the release of the press release information and the release of the actual scientific data, the press had taken it and ran with it. Okay, and so now we have a snowball. Everybody's saying, well, doctor in France treated all these patients and all but 2 of them survived. And those 2 were going to die anyway. So other people started trying it. And none of these were done in what we call a traditional way. All right. So randomized, double-blinded, control group, all the regular scientific rigor that goes with testing whether something is effective or not. Plus, we have to understand that there's something called, confounding variables. Confounding variables need to be, they're part of the study design to eliminate them. This wasn't a study, this was an experiment, let's be very clear. So somehow this, crossed the pond and came to our attention here in the United States, and we started seeing advocacy for it. And that rose up the chain all the way to, to the White House. So, so what we needed to do, or what we must do, is step back and understand first the molecular basis of its usage. Where does it act? Okay, we know where all of these other drugs act. We know where the antivirals act and how they act. We've studied them because of 2 decades of molecular biology advancement and the fight against HIV. We haven't gone back to some of these drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine that we discovered a long time ago that we needed in the fight against, what we call poor man's diseases. Okay, malaria, helminthic, tapeworm, and all these weird third world diseases were treated by these drugs that we have not used. If we haven't used them since we had to fight those drugs 50, 60, 70 years, those diseases 50, 60, 70 years ago. But there are those who want to see whether they are effective because they were effective against those infections, even though they're a totally different class of infectious agent. They were trained in a different era, those doctors, and I am trained in this era where I don't trust a drug unless I can verify its molecular mechanism of action. Okay, it's not a bias. It's just an advancement in thinking. Okay. I mean, if we have evidence at the cellular and subcellular level that's reproducible and that it has a low risk profile, and we've tested it in silico, in vivo, in vitro, in animal models, and in humans, that's the way we do it now. But just giving it to 36 patients along with 2 other confounding medications does not evidence make. Okay. But let me just conclude by the important stuff that John wants me to say. The indications here for hydroxychloroquine are pretty strictly for use in lupus and autoimmune disease. I'm not going to go through this list. It's a waste of time for me to read everything, okay? But the contraindications are very long. They're much longer than the indications. And the toxicity and risk profile is very high. So what we don't want anyone to do is try to buy this themselves or try to convince their doctor that they should prescribe it for them. All right. There is a lot of news that, doctors prescribe off-label all the time, and, they use different drugs for purposes that they know are effective, but aren't necessarily approved or studied by FDA and et cetera. And that is true. And we do advance the science by gathering that kind of evidence and then resubmitting it for tests and lobbying the FDA for approval for new uses. There's no doubt about that. But as far as what my advice goes right now is, 1, it's not prophylactic, which means it can't protect you from COVID. There's no evidence that will protect you from COVID. Number 2, there is not enough, or there is only anecdotal evidence that it treats COVID effectively. And what I mean by that is the evidence mountain is tiny. So please don't ask your doctor to prescribe it for you if you do not have one of the conditions for which it is indicated. Okay? All right. Did I do enough on that? Because I don't want to
get
do
to
it.
talk about this.
What?
Your favorite thing on the screen.
Yes. Well, my second favorite thing. My favorite thing is the last thing we're going to do. So, okay, evolved over the last 6 weeks, we've discovered that this disease, well, the first week and 2 weeks it hit Europe, right? Because the Chinese they were just shit poor about telling us what this thing was, other than giving us, samples of it and saying, here's a sequence and things like that. Their clinical histories of the thousands that were affected weren't readily available to us. And so what we did know is that it was causing SARS, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, okay? And that it was a coronavirus. And with that information, patients were, coming into the hospitals in France and Italy and Spain with their lungs half filled with fluid and with fevers above 103, 104, and they were crashing. And so what do you do with a crashing patient? You take them upstairs and you throw them in the ICU. You check their pulse ox and you do the basics in supportive therapy because you have nothing else to give them, okay? You try to control their fever and you try to get them oxygenated. So what did we do? We started putting them on ventilators. Then the news spread that, oh my God, we're running, Italy's running out of ventilators. What's the rest of the world going to do? Ventilators are expensive, et cetera, et cetera. Then it evolved that not just the lungs, but other organs and, even the blood was being affected. These patients were also being observed to have disseminated clotting. The clots were showing up as pulmonary embolisms. They were showing up as infarcts in the liver, heart, kidneys, GI, microinfarcts. There were patients losing circulation to the digits. Hands, tips turning black, toes turning black. So all kinds of weirdness on the level of clotting and, what we call the intravasculature. And then also when patients hit a certain stage of the disease, even before the pneumonia, their body was reacting with what we call cytokine storm. So the cytokine storm is the immune system goes into sixth gear and just erupts with all of these mast cells, all of these white blood cells telling each other, there's a systemic infection, everybody to battle stations. And then it just releases all of these cell signaling chemicals, and you get this huge insurgent immune response. All right, so armed with all of that knowledge, smart people in the pharmacology world said, okay, well, docs, why don't we try what we usually try when we see this stuff? And that is when you see disseminated intravascular coagulation, clotting everywhere, let's give them heparin, low molecular weight, and let's see if we can control the clotting. In a number of patients, in a number of scenarios, again, an approved drug for an approved indication in a hospital setting, monitored by a multidisciplinary team, it worked. A lot fewer patients over the last 3 weeks have seen disseminated intravascular coagulation, resulting in all of these horrors, because more and more doctors are using the standard of care when it comes to clotting. Second, immune modulators. What can we do to prevent the cytokine storm? Well, we have monoclonal antibody therapy. We have something as simple as antihistamines. So one of the antihistamines that has long been used to treat GERD, as you know, GERD is you know it is indigestion, but it's just the regurgitation of stomach acid. So tamp down the stomach acid amounts. You give Pepcid. Pepcid's chemical name is famotidine. Tocilizumab as well as siltuximab are monoclonal antibodies that are modulators of interleukin-6. They are also showing effectiveness when given to COVID patients to prevent or to tone down the cytokine storm. And then the big guns, the antivirals, going after the source agent, which is the virus itself, are drugs from the HIV arsenal, as well as newer drugs. So remdesivir, you've heard of in the news. My assessment is remdesivir will be secondary to an agent called leronlimab. So leronlimab goes after the way that the virus actually enters the cells. So if you give leronlimab, it immediately stops the replication cycle and the virus can't continue to reproduce itself. Remdesivir also has a similar interference in the life cycle of the virus, but it acts after the virus has already entered the cell. So it's one step later. And then another one, favipiravir, which is only available right now in Japan, in Asia. I think it's available in South Korea too, which may be coming here. It's also showing efficacy in interrupting the life cycle of the virus. So when you put them all together, you get trimodal therapy. And this is what is going to cut down mortality and morbidity in these patients. So for every 1,000 patients that go into the hospital 6 weeks ago, a certain percentage of them ended up with really bad course of disease because none of these were known to help. 6 weeks later, let's call it 8 weeks later, we know that they all have some efficacy, and when we put them together, their superpowers join, and they turn into a pharmaceutical Voltron. So, okay. So Sandra has a question about each of these drugs, and all of these drugs except for leronlimab, the ones in the middle, the antivirals, all of the other drugs have passed all of those controlled, blinded RCT for the indicated usage, just like hydroxychloroquine, but they are being used because of their molecular basis of their molecular mechanism of action. So we know exactly where they're working, and that's why we use them.
Okay, we need to move into our last segment here, which is what do we need to do, or what are the steps that need to be taken to return to normal?
Okay, and John always pushes me to the next topic before I've answered the last question. So Jen is asking, what is the availability of trimodal therapy drugs? Specifically, do hospitals have adequate supply, and which ones are under patent protection? I can't answer your patent protection question. I simply do not know. The availability is what I described as the immunomodulators and the anticoagulants readily available. The antivirals, remdesivir, the initial batch of doses went to the hotspots. So I think 4,400 doses went to New York, and then another significant amount went to Miami, New Orleans, Chicago, and as well as San Francisco, LA. So wherever there was a potential usage because of high demand, that's where they sent it, which is great. And so we should have more data on whether it is useful and how useful it is and when and all, and dosage. And so remdesivir is under kind of a emergent trial right now. Leronlimab is in a much smaller use case scenario. So we'll figure out when that becomes more prominent and the data becomes more readily available. But one thing I'm proud of is John and I bring to you these words, these names, these concepts about 2 weeks before you hear them in the news. So you should be hearing about this kind of trimodal therapy and the drugs we're talking about shortly. But to fully answer your question, the practice of medicine across the United States is non-standardized. The academic medical centers will more likely have access to these drugs than your community hospitals. So it is not available everywhere, and not all the doctors across the country know about it.
Sanjay, there's a question on Facebook about whether the advice that was going around about about avoiding aspirin and ibuprofen is still valid.
Great question. Well, let's say that the initial guidance that was provided by EU sources, let's call it, the multiple inputs that came from Europe, especially France, regarding patients who had come trying to control their fever with ibuprofen had fared worse than those who had just taken aspirin or Tylenol. In the European context, it's called paracetamol. In our context, it's called acetaminophen. It's Tylenol. That initial reporting was not accurate. It was not necessarily wrong, but it was not accurate in terms of the numbers of patients and the actual, potential detriment of taking ibuprofen. So, in our context, I would continue to advise that aspirin is safe for controlling fever, and if you're taking it for as a prophylaxis, if you have atrial fibrillation, if you have other coronary artery disease, etc., aspirin is safe. You can take it at 81 milligrams. You can continue to take it. It's fine. Aspirin is also safe for control of fever in larger amounts than the daily low dose. So that's fine. Aspirin is never safe in children. Aspirin in children can result in something called Reye syndrome. And I don't need to go into that. This is not a consultation, but you don't give aspirin to children. All right. Control of fever versus control of pain. There's always been a debate as to which agent is better. These are all non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. They all act in the same manner, but they act in different methods. Okay. So, Tylenol is a centrally acting agent, which means that it modulates something in the neurochemical axis that brings your fever down. Okay, this in COVID may end up showing to be safer than ibuprofen, which works at a level of the prostaglandins and the local kind of pain and fever response. It may be that the local pain and fever response mitigation by ibuprofen could, we don't know, allow the virus to be more comfortable in its spread. So is it safe to take? Most likely, yes. I recommend and prefer Tylenol for control of fever and ibuprofen for control of pain. Okay. What am I doing now? Oh, yeah. So we had a lot to do this week, a lot of reading, a lot of crunching, but here we are. So everyone wants to know.
Not a lot of sleeping.
No, not a lot.
Zero sleep.
So we're living in a world of risk right now, okay? And I think we're being distracted by a lot of media nonsense, our own personal, leanings and biases. But if asked to work on this at the, if I were to step into the shoes of someone at the CDC, at NIH or whatever, this is what I would do. This is what I would stress. This is what I would take to Congress and the White House and urge them to do as soon as possible. And again, this reflects my knowledge, my experience, and both as a, clinically as a physician, but also in the worlds that I have been privileged to work in, such as population health and clinical genomics and evidence-based medicine. So here it is. We live in a world of risk, and the risk has been presented to us by this pandemic. So one of one of five things, the first of five things that we need to really address is we need to know the prevalence of this disease. We need to know how many asymptomatic carriers there are, how long they asymptomatically carry for, how many people are seropositive, have converted from illness into protective neutralizing antibodies. All of those numbers are very important. If seroprevalence, which is also a proxy for herd immunity, is 3% or 5%, or in some places high as 20%, then we approach those areas differently. Okay, it's not a one size fit all. You can't shut down a county or a state because you shouldn't, I should say, going forward, we shouldn't do that. We should have granular level data that allows us to understand the risk levels in not broad geographies, but in specific areas because of specific reasons and specific threats. So we need to address the prevalence, assess the prevalence, and that means we have to provide testing on demand. Love it to be free because, I think in the wealthiest country in the world, we should provide free testing. In Germany, you can buy swab tests for $18. I don't know if they're providing them free because they're not in the same position that we're in right now. We have the highest number of cases. We have the highest number of deaths. We need to get really, really serious on getting through this. Okay, so I'd love it to be free, and because the reason I'm saying this is because we talked about social determinants of health, like 4 or 5 weeks ago, John, about when we first learned that the urban Black Hispanic communities are disproportionately being affected because of their living conditions, because of lack of access to healthcare, all those reasons. We need to test the bum on the street because we need to know that he's, not going to end up with it and spread it, by inadvertently sitting on a park bench that your aunt is going to come and sit on tomorrow, and then take that home and infect her husband. And it goes on and on like that. These are the nightmares that epidemiologists suffer, okay? We need to test everyone. Everyone who wants a test needs to get a test in reality, okay? That is important. So serial detection and antibody testing on demand, that means people with a very high risk job, like people in healthcare or people that work in, stores where they're providing services to hundreds of people a day. They need to be tested similar to what was proposed in New York, which is if you work in a nursing home, you need to be tested twice a week. Because if you bring a virus into a nursing home, you're going to kill someone. Their infection fatality rate isn't hovering around 1.5%. It's at around 12 to 14%. Okay, you're going to kill someone. So we need to have serial detection tests for those that work in high risk scenarios, and then antibody testing on demand. If you say, look, I recovered from a wicked bad illness, and I want to know and contribute to the data set of seroprevalence, I want to know if I have the antibodies. So that's that top line. Okay, so rigorous contact tracing. Again, let's get back down to the bubble and the granular data. I'm soon to include John into my bubble. I'm going to invite John over, and we're going to have burgers, okay? Or we're going to have whatever he likes to eat. Ideally, I invite him over after he stopped at Rite Aid and got a swab test, and it came back negative, right? But if it came back positive, the swab test, John's not coming over, all right? And John needs to talk to somebody about the last 25 days of his life. And after that, that person needs to talk to those people that John came in contact with and find out if any of them are sick or were sick. And then we need to work on how to humanely quarantine, either at home or somehow, only those people who are positive. There are lots of problems with this second line, all right? But I think the most important problem that myself and my colleagues in the scientific community, biomedical community have to tackle is the sensitivity of the tests. They've got to be highly sensitive. We can't deal with false negatives anymore. We have screwed this up in the first 6 weeks. We can't, just got to lock that down. 95% sensitivity or above only, and only those people who are doing tests with that kind of sensitivity should be allowed to do those tests. All right, next, healthcare access. We need a temporary COVID treatment for all. If you're sick with COVID, do not be scared to come to the hospital and get treated, because you'll get a $40,000 or $400,000 bill. Somehow or the other, if we're going to eliminate it from our communities, especially communities that have huge levels of wealth disparity and health access disparity, we cannot allow people to be scared and live scared without getting treated. And then this is something we covered again last week, which is you've returned to business. You are doing great, and you are one of these cases above, on one of these above that we just discussed. You work at Best Buy, and there's a huge demand of people coming in and out. 200, 300 people are shopping at your store, and you're keeping yourself safe and you're doing all the regular stuff. But week 3, you start feeling sick, and then you get tested and you're positive, and you have to be quarantined. At the earning potential there, these stores, large stores, family businesses and others, we can talk about that, but they need to be able to provide paid convalescence for 6 weeks. You need to take these people out of the workforce, because all they're going to do is continue to infect others. And they need to be able to go home and get better, and not infect any more people and not worry about the bills. All right. Data and analytics, my world. Give me the data, give me all of the data, and give me nothing but the data. We need to be able to have the data to assess daily trends, granular level, at the level of a zip code or a neighborhood, to be able to control, track, and trace, and eliminate threat before it spreads to the part of the geography where you need to shut down an entire geography, which is stupid because it affects too many lives. And next week or the week after that, we're going to have Dr. J.J. Racimus, who is an MD, PhD, psychiatrist, toxicologist, join us and talk about diseases of despair, because they're already growing, and locking down people or locking down geographies for more time is just going to foster their growth. And we can avoid that if you can give people like me the opportunity to develop these strategies and implement them. So recommended strategy is people should start to listen, right? We need to have some way to get Dr. Rachel Levine and all of her colleagues and peers across all the states access to this data so they can make the best decisions on a day-to-day basis. And that will, data is power. And then lastly, important, not as important as the other 5, but important is tracking of strains that are inbound to our country. So like we said earlier in the town hall, you could have gotten it, the New York strain recovered, you've got antibodies against the New York strain, and then a new antigenic strain arrives in New York City from from wherever, from Spain, Italy, you name it. And then we're, back to square one to some extent. So airport testing, inbound immigration, customs, all of that stuff in a humane way. So there we go.
All right, we have one last slide. It's our new graphic that you wanted to touch on. So let me put that up. There we go.
Okay. So this was contributed by a fan of what John and I are doing. And I'm just going to say her name is Vanessa. You'd be able to find her if you ask me personally, PM John or me, for if you're looking for her to do some work for you. She contributed this, her time and expertise, so that we could have a graphic that goes along with the slide previously that I just discussed. So how can everybody get involved in breaking the link so that we don't live in this cycle, right? So we need very strict protection of susceptible hosts, like the immunocompromised, the elderly. What's happening in nursing homes in this country and also in the UK, but specifically in this country and in our region, is criminal, period. I'm privy to the protocols and practices of nursing homes in my area, and what they're doing is totally absurd, is dangerous, and I don't know if they just don't have the right advice, or whatever is happening is wrong, and we need better protection for these people. But not only these people, right? So we have high-risk patients, but they're not the spreaders. Okay, so we need to start understanding who potentially are the healthy and active in society and contributing to the economy and all of that are also potentially spreading this virus and keeping it active. Now, why is this whole thing important? It's because that the next stage is obviously, we don't have this stuff yet. We don't have an appropriate treatment. We don't have an appropriate vaccine, and we're only just now learning to decontaminate our businesses, our workplaces, our whatever. So this infectious agent, this is the cycle generally, but this infectious agent, COVID, that causes COVID, SARS-CoV-2, is just really newly identified, and we don't know enough about it yet. So, I volunteer myself and all of my biomedical army to break that link, but we need help with the rest of them. So the rest of them are, breaking the link. Once we have immunizations, please get immunized. Promote healthy practices in your businesses. Learn how to effectively decontaminate, and get, once your businesses are back and running, they're going to run differently. Be okay with that, and adhere to certain safety standards, not with fear, but armed with the information that what you do with those practices is actually going to contribute to the safety of your clients and your staff. So again, this extends to understanding someone who comes into your business, and I don't want this to be controversial. Someone who comes into your business without a mask is potentially putting your other customers at risk. It's putting your staff at risk, and they should be told that it's not a good idea to do that. This is because they're potentially coming in, one, not knowing the status of whether they have the virus or not, and without a mask, the likelihood of them, the vapors that come out of their nose and mouth, the aerosolized saliva, will fall and create fomites for infection to other people. John's favorite part of the show was when I put my mask on, right? Bend it over the nose. If you wear glasses, you can do the loop, and that will allow you to have a good seal over your face. Sorry, I pulled out too hard. And now you have a good seal, okay? So people coming into your businesses as you reintegrate, or your workplace, will be using cloth masks. That's fine. And your exposure to them is probably less than 10-15 minutes. If it's longer than that, then your staff should have to be trained with higher protection levels. You must think of these as these opportunities for transmission as really dependent on the duration of exposure. So if John comes over for burgers and he didn't stop at Rite Aid and get his test, if we're sitting 3 feet away from each other and talking without masks, risk is high. If we're sitting together and talking with masks, risk is lower, but that risk increases with the longer we spend time together. Okay, so if I go to John's nail salon and he's doing my manicure, even with masks on, since we're 3 feet apart, the concentration of inoculum is high, the duration that I'm sitting with him is long, the risk for transmission goes up with every extended minute and proximity that we share. Okay.
Question. Brian wants to know how and if and how face shields help.
Okay, great. So face shields should only be used in the workplace. They should not be used by the general public. Face shields are used in any environment where there's a splash risk. Okay, so if you're working in a warehouse, or if you're working in any industrial or healthcare or service industry. So if you're working in a restaurant and you're handling, whatever that is coming in contact with your clients. For example, dishes. Lou, you there? We good? Okay, dishes, dishwashers, stuff like that. Okay, you want to be wearing a face shield because you could be washing the dishes. There could be adequate soap, but somebody could have sneezed on that plate, and if it splashes up, you want some sort of protection. Okay, healthcare workers should also know their own. I'm not going to sit here and train at the level of what a healthcare worker needs to do, but if you work in the service industry and you work around anything that could splash up on your face, then you should wear a face shield. If not, there's no need.
All right. I think we're almost at 3 hours, so we're going to call it quits, at least on the official live stream and the official broadcast.
Okay.
We will stick around for a couple minutes after. There may be some questions that we didn't get to, or you may have follow-up questions too. We are upgrading to a different system for next week that will better manage question management. So there's that.
Awesome.
But,
thank you, John, for all your work. Thank you so much, John.
But we are done for the evening. Stick around if you want. We'll be here for another 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
But we want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And have a great week. Stay safe. Wash your hands.